The day of my son's wedding, I took the Greyhound bus. 14 hours. Pittsburgh to Savannah. Coach seat by the window, the kind that doesn't recline all the way, with a crack running up the armrest that caught my jacket sleeve every time I shifted. I had a carry-on bag with my dress shirt, my good slacks, and a card with a check inside for $20,000 that I'd been saving since Marcus got engaged. I want you to think about that for a second. $20,000. And I took the Greyhound, not because I couldn't afford a plane ticket. I could. I don't know. I've always been that way. My wife used to say I was the only man she knew who could have $1 million in the bank and still clip coupons at the grocery store. I never saw the point in spending money on comfort when the destination was what mattered. The bus got me there. That was enough. My knees don't bend the way they used to. I've got a bone spur on my left heel that flares up when I sit too long. And by hour 9, somewhere outside of Charlotte, it was screaming at me. I walked the aisle twice just to get the blood moving, holding onto the seatbacks, nodding at the few people still awake. An old woman near the back was asleep with her head against the window. I thought about my wife. She would have made friends with that woman by hour 2. Would have known her whole life story before we crossed into South Carolina. Carol passed 4 years ago, breast cancer, then it spread. Marcus was there at the end. My daughter-in-law Renee was not. She sent flowers to the funeral home. The arrangement had a card that said, "Our thoughts are with you." Not my thoughts. Our thoughts. Like she'd signed it on behalf of a corporation. I told myself it didn't mean anything. People grieve differently. People show up differently. Renee was busy. She had her own family, her own life. Marcus loved her, and Marcus was a good man, and that was what mattered. I told myself that for 4 years. The bus pulled into Savannah at 6:47 in the morning. The wedding was at 4 in the afternoon at a venue on the waterfront. One of those restored cotton warehouses with exposed brick and Edison bulbs and a catering bill I did not want to think about. Marcus had told me the whole thing cost over $60,000. Renee's parents were contributing some. I was contributing the 20 in the envelope. Marcus and Renee were covering the rest with a loan they'd taken against their condo. I found a diner 2 blocks from the bus station and ordered eggs and coffee and sat by the window watching Savannah wake up. The moss hanging from the live oaks. The street still quiet. I've always liked the South in the early morning, before the heat settles in. The wedding was being held at 4, but the rehearsal dinner the night before. I hadn't been invited to that. Marcus had mentioned it once quickly and said it was just Renee's family and close friends, and I'd said, of course, no problem, and changed the subject. I was good at that. Changing the subject. I had my hotel. A Hampton Inn 8 blocks from the venue. Nothing fancy. I checked in, showered, ironed my shirt in the room, and sat on the edge of the bed for a while just thinking about Carol. How she would have been in that hotel room with me, fixing my collar, telling me to stop frowning. How she would have already sent Marcus a text that morning with something warm and a little embarrassing that he'd roll his eyes at and secretly love. I put the card with the check in my breast pocket and walked to the venue. The warehouse had a side entrance for family, and I found it, went in and gave my name to a young woman with a clipboard. She looked at it, looked up at me, looked back down at the clipboard. "And you are Marcus's father." "That's right." "Okay." She made a small mark. "You're in the family section, left side, 3rd row." 3rd row. I didn't say anything. I thanked her and went in. The room was beautiful, I'll give them that. Whoever planned it had an eye for these things. The Edison bulbs were warm against the brick, and there were white flowers everywhere. Ranunculus, I think, though Carol would have known for certain. And the chairs were covered in ivory linen with small sprigs of eucalyptus tied to the backs. It smelled like a garden. I found my seat, third row, left side. There was a woman already seated next to me, one of Renee's aunts, who smiled politely and then turned back to her phone. In the front row, I could see the back of Renee's parents' heads. Her father, Gerald, a big man with silver hair, was turned sideways talking to someone and laughing loudly. Her mother, Diane, was gesturing at a florist who come to adjust something on the altar arrangement. Second row was filled with Renee's siblings, her brother, her two sisters, a few people I didn't recognize. Third row. That was where Marcus's father sat. I took out the card from my pocket and held it in my hands for a moment. Then I put it back. The ceremony started late, which I expected. Marcus came out from a side door with the officiant, and when he turned and saw me, he smiled. A real smile. The one he's had since he was 7 years old. The one that's all Carl. And I felt my chest do something complicated. He looked good. He looked happy. That was real. Whatever else was happening. My son was happy on his wedding day, and that mattered. Renee came down the aisle on her father's arm, and she was lovely. I want to be clear about that. She's a beautiful woman. She looked like a painting. Gerald kissed her cheek and handed her to Marcus and sat down in the front row. And I watched my son take his bride's hands. And I thought about the 14 hours on the Greyhound and the bone spur in the third row, and decided none of it mattered. I was there. That was enough. The reception was in the same building, the chairs rearranged and the tables brought out. I found my place card at a table near the back corner. Table 11. I counted. The head table. Marcus and Renee and the wedding party was at the front. Gerald and Diane had a table just to the left of it, with 8 of Renee's relatives. Table 2. I was at table 11 with 2 of Marcus's college friends I'd never met, their wives, and an elderly couple who turned out to be Renee's great-aunt and great-uncle who had flown in from Phoenix and were confused about where they were supposed to be sitting. I helped them get sorted. We talked for a while. They were lovely people. The dinner was served. I ate the salmon. The speeches started. Gerald gave a long toast about Renee that made people laugh and then cry. Diane gave a shorter one. The best man gave one. The maid of honor gave one. Marcus gave one. About Renee, about love, about building a life together. He didn't mention his mother. He didn't mention me. I told myself the speeches were running long and he'd had to cut things. I told myself that. After dinner there was dancing and I stepped outside for some air. The venue had a small courtyard on the riverside, and I went out and stood at the railing and looked at the water. The Savannah River at night, the lights from the bridge reflecting. It was a warm evening for November. I could hear the music from inside, something with a good beat, and I could hear people laughing. I heard the door open behind me and I assumed it was a guest coming out for air, so I moved slightly to give them room. It was Renee, and behind her, her mother Diane. They didn't see me. I was standing in the shadow of a support column, and they went to the other end of the railing, maybe 20 feet away, and Diane immediately said something in a low voice, and Renee answered, and at first I couldn't make it out. Then Diane's voice went slightly louder, the way voices do when someone is worked up and trying not to be. Could have wired the money directly. We didn't need him here at all. Renee said something I couldn't catch. I saw the seat, third row. It's not like anyone's gonna. And then Renee, clear as anything. He took the bus, Mom. The Greyhound. Marcus was mortified. Diane made a sound, halfway between a laugh and a sigh. I just don't understand why he couldn't have flown in like a normal person. It's embarrassing. Gerald's colleagues were asking who he was. He is who he is, Renee said. And there was nothing cruel in her voice. That was almost the worst part. She said it the way you'd say, "The weather is what it is. Flat. Finished. A thing not worth discussing further. Just make sure to check clear before you deposit it," Diane said. "You said he writes them from a credit union." "It'll clear," Renee said. "It always does." They went back inside. I stood at the railing for a while. The water kept moving. Somewhere downstream, a boat horn sounded low and long. He took the Greyhound. Marcus was mortified. I thought about the crack in the armrest that kept catching my sleeve. I thought about the bone spur, about hour 9, about the old woman asleep against the window. I thought about the card in my breast pocket and what it had cost me. Not just the money, but the months of watching it carefully, the transfers, the decisions not to replace the hot water heater that was running slow, decisions that seemed reasonable at the time because my son was getting married and I wanted to give him something real. I thought about the credit union comment. I have accounts at 3 institutions. The credit union is where I keep my operating cash. The other 2 are where I keep the rest being, well, enough to make Gerald's contribution to this wedding look like a rounding error. I've never told Marcus the full picture. Carol and I agreed on that a long time ago. We both came from nothing. We built what we built slowly, carefully, and we didn't want money to change the way our son saw himself or saw us. We wanted him to work for things. He did. Marcus worked hard. He became an engineer. He earns a real salary, pays his own bills, owns his own home. We were proud of him. I was still proud of him. I was also standing alone in a courtyard in Savannah, having just heard my daughter-in-law describe me to her mother like I was a minor inconvenience that had been adequately managed. I went back inside. I found Marcus between songs, standing near the bar with the best man. And I touched his arm and he turned. His face did something when he saw me, something quick, gone before I could read it fully. I told myself it was just the emotion of the day. "Hey, Dad." He hugged me. "You smell like the cologne Carol used to buy him at Christmas. You doing okay? You finding everything all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "It's a beautiful wedding, son." "Yeah." He looked around at the room, proud and relieved in the way that people are when something they've worried about for a year actually comes together. "It really came out great, didn't it?" "It did." I reached into my breast pocket and took out the card. "I wanted to give you this." He took it, glanced at it, tucked it into his jacket. "Thanks, Dad. You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to," I said. "I wanted to." He squeezed my shoulder once and then someone called his name from across the room and he was gone, pulled back into the current of the evening. I watched him go. I stayed another hour. I danced once with Renee's great aunt, who was a very good dancer and told me her husband had 2 left feet and she'd been compensating for 53 years. She made me laugh. A real laugh. Then I said goodbye to no one in particular and walked back to the Hampton Inn. In the room, I took off my jacket and sat on the edge of the bed and called my attorney. Raymond has been my attorney for 22 years. He picked up on the 3rd ring, which told me he was still at the office, which was not surprising because Raymond works on Saturdays and probably holidays and possibly in his sleep. "How is the wedding?" he asked. "Good," I said. "I need to make some changes." There was a pause. How significant. Significant. Another pause. Raymond doesn't ask unnecessary questions. It's why I've kept him for 22 years. I can have documents ready by Tuesday. "Monday," I said. "Monday," he agreed. I slept well that night. Better than I'd slept in months, actually. I don't know what that says about me. I had breakfast at the same diner the next morning, same table by the window. Eggs and coffee, the moss and the oaks, the streets quiet. I changed my ticket. I was flying home, not busing. I allowed myself that. My flight wasn't until 2, so I had time, and I sat there for a while and thought about what I was going to do and whether I felt guilty about it, and the honest answer was that I didn't feel guilty at all, which surprised me a little. I'd always thought I would feel guilty. I'd always imagined some scenario where I'd have to make a hard choice about the trust, about the estate plan, about the structure that Raymond and I had spent years building, and I'd imagined I'd feel torn. But sitting in that diner with my eggs, I just felt clear. There's a thing that happens when you see something plainly, when the version of reality you've been maintaining, the story you've been telling yourself about how things are, suddenly doesn't match what you actually saw and heard. Something drops away. The effort of maintaining the story drops away, and what you're left with is just what's true. What was true, my son loved his wife. What was also true, my son's wife saw me as an inconvenience, a check that needed to clear, a man who rode the Greyhound and embarrassed her husband in front of Gerald's colleagues. What was true, I had built over 40 years a careful and private and quite considerable fortune in commercial real estate and municipal bonds and a few other things I'd never discussed at family dinners. I owned 11 properties across 3 states. The credit union account, the one Renee had mentioned, held approximately $9,000. Everything else was held in a trust. Carol and I had set it up together. It had been written to benefit Marcus, and when grandchildren arrived, our grandchildren, the idea was that it would pass on quietly and he would understand the full scope of it only when he was older, when we were gone. I'd always planned to tell him before that, sit him down some Sunday afternoon and explain it, walk him through it. I'd been putting it off, not for any particular reason, just the way you put things off. On Monday, Raymond made changes, not to cut Marcus out. I want to be clear about that. I am not that kind of person. Marcus is my son, and I love him, and what I felt in that courtyard was hurt, not hatred. What I changed had nothing to do with punishment. What I changed was the structure. The original trust had been a joint benefit, assets to Marcus and Renee as a marital unit, no distinctions. What Raymond drafted on Monday created a different architecture. Separate trustee oversight, provisions that protected the principal from being used for joint liabilities, joint debt, joint real estate, joint anything that Renee's name was on. Marcus's direct benefit remained intact, even increased. His children, if and when they had them, were protected fully, but the trust was no longer a resource that a person could look at and think that'll handle the loan on the condo. That version was gone. I also removed the provision that had made Raymond the successor trustee and replaced it with a 3-person panel. Raymond, a woman at my firm who's been with me for 15 years, and a trust officer at one of my banks. I didn't want any one person to be in a position to be pressured. I flew home on Monday afternoon. The flight was 40 minutes. I had a window seat. 3 weeks later, Marcus called me. It was a Thursday evening, and I was on my back porch with a glass of iced tea watching the last of the light go out of the sky. "Dad," he said, "I need to talk to you about something." "All right," I said. He'd spoken with Raymond. Raymond had followed my instructions to the letter, which meant that when Marcus had called to ask some general questions, the kind of questions that suggested Renee had encouraged him to ask, Raymond had been professional and informative and had made clear that the trust documentation was current and final and that any previous drafts were superseded. Marcus was confused. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was confused. I didn't realize the structure had changed," he said. "Raymond said it's been updated. Recently." "It has," I said. Silence. "Can I ask why?" I set down my iced tea. I'd been thinking about what I was going to say for 3 weeks, And what I'd landed on was the same thing I'd always believed, which was that the truth, spoken plainly, was usually the kindest option. "Because I heard a conversation at your wedding," I said, "between Renee and her mother, on the courtyard by the river." Another silence. Longer. "Dad, I'm not angry, Marcus. I want you to hear that. I'm not calling to fight with you, and I'm not asking you to choose between your wife and me. That's not what this is." He was quiet. "What I heard told me that Renee sees me in a particular way, as a resource, a check from a credit union that needs to clear." I paused. "That's her prerogative. I can't control how people see me, but it told me that the original plan, the way the trust was written, it needed to reflect what I actually know now, rather than what I'd assumed." "What did you hear exactly?" His voice was careful. I told him. All of it. The railing, the river, the words. I didn't editorialize. I just told him what I'd heard, the way I'd tell Raymond something. Factually, clearly, without drama. When I finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "She didn't mean it like that." "Maybe not," I said. She gets nervous around family events and she says things to my mom and it comes out wrong." "Marcus," I said gently, "I'm not prosecuting your wife. I'm explaining a decision I made. You're allowed to disagree with the decision. But it's made." More silence. "The trust. My share is still, your share is intact," I said. "Better than intact, actually. Raymond can walk you through it. You personally are protected. Any children you have are protected. What changed is the joint structure." I could hear him processing that. "You think Renee was after the money. I think Renee knew more about my finances than I'd ever shared with anyone, and that she described a check from a credit union to her mother as something that needed to clear, and that her mother responded by questioning whether I should have been invited to the wedding at all." I paused. "Make of that what you will." He didn't argue after that. Not really. He asked a few more questions and I answered them honestly. And then he said he needed time to think. And I said that was fine. Take all the time you need. He hung up. I picked up my iced tea. The sky was fully dark now. The neighbor 2 lots over had a wind chime that I usually found annoying, but that evening it sounded okay. Marcus called back 11 days later. He asked if he could come for the weekend. I said yes. He drove up on Friday evening, and we sat on the porch, and I made the chili that he's liked since he was a kid, and we talked about some things and didn't talk about others, and on Saturday morning he helped me fix the hot water heater that I'd been putting off. He didn't bring Renee. He didn't explain that, and I didn't ask. What I know is that he stayed through Sunday afternoon, and when he left, he hugged me the way he hadn't hugged me in years. Both arms and held for a second, the way he used to when he was small and something had scared him. My son, Carol's boy, the smile that goes all the way to his eyes. There are things I don't know yet. How his marriage weathers this. How Renee feels about what Marcus told her, or didn't tell her. Whether any of it changes anything between them. I've stopped trying to predict those things. That's his life to navigate. What I know is this. I took the Greyhound because I've always believed it's the destination that matters, not the comfort of the getting there. I still believe that. But I've learned, later than I should have maybe, that you have to be honest about what the destination actually is, what you're actually walking into. You can't give someone a map to your whole life's work just because you love them. You have to know first what they'd do with it. Carol always said I trusted too easily. She said it like a complaint, but she also said it like she loved me for it. I think both things were true. The credit union account has $9,000 in it. It always will. The rest is in a trust, carefully tended, clearly written, built for the people I know, not the people I assumed. The Greyhound, for what it's worth, was fine. I've thought a lot about that courtyard, the way the river looked at night, the lights from the bridge, the sound of music coming through the walls. I've thought about what I would have done if I'd walked back inside 5 seconds earlier and never heard any of it. I think I would have gone on the way I had been, telling myself that Renee was just reserved, just different from us, just someone who needed more time. I would have deposited that story like I'd deposited every uncomfortable thing over the years, filed it somewhere I didn't have to look at it. People do that. I did that for a long time. It's not weakness exactly, it's more like a habit of hopefulness that stops being useful at a certain point. What stopped it for me was hearing my own name said like a liability. There's something that happens when you build a life carefully and quietly, when you work for 40 years without broadcasting it, without needing anyone to see it, and then you discover that your silence was interpreted as ignorance, that the people closest to you filled in the blank of what you were with whatever was convenient for them. Renee didn't see a man who chose the Greyhound. She saw a man who could only afford the Greyhound. That's not a small mistake. That's a whole architecture of assumptions. And assumptions like that don't stay in one room. They spread. I don't fault her for being who she is. I genuinely don't. People are shaped by what they value, and Renee values certain things, and she learned to read the world through that lens, and that's her life to live. What I couldn't do anymore was pretend the lens didn't exist. That was the thing I owed myself. Intelligence, to me, has never been about what you know. It's about what you're willing to see clearly, even when it's uncomfortable. When Marcus called me confused and a little defensive, the easier path would have been to soften it, to say I'd overreacted, that I misheard, that the trust changes were just a routine update. I didn't do that. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because clarity, once you've found it, is hard to let go of. And Marcus deserved clarity too. He deserved to know what his father actually heard, from the actual railing and the actual words. Everything after that was his to navigate. That's the hardest part of loving someone who's an adult. You can't protect them from the truth about their own life. You can only refuse to participate in the fiction. The character part, what I'd call the grit of it, was quieter than people might imagine. It wasn't dramatic. It was just making the call to Raymond that night, sitting on the edge of a hotel bed in my dress shirt and saying the thing out loud that I'd been not saying for 4 years. It was choosing not to absorb the discomfort so that everyone else could stay comfortable. That took something. I don't know what to call it exactly. Resolve, maybe? The kind that comes not from anger, but from finally, fully respecting yourself enough to act on what you know. Marcus sat with me on that porch and ate the chili and helped me fix the water heater. We didn't solve everything that weekend. Some of it may never fully resolve. But he hugged me the way he used to, and that told me the most important thing was still intact. The rest is just money. And money, properly arranged, takes care of itself.